This is a ZeeHoo. It's a 95 watt car charger. I received this to review for free, but if you wanted to buy it, it would cost you about $26. Now, they haven't paid me for my review, and my opinions are my own. So in the box, we get a overview card and the actual car charger itself. It's nice and small. It has two USB-C ports and a USB-A port. I'm looking for a device that can rapid charge two phones for driver and passenger, while at the same time powering a 5 volt, probably just 1 amp, like 5 watts for a car dash cam. So the tricky thing is, a lot of these guys, when you put a 5 volt output in this USB-A port, one of these two USB-C ports derates to only 5 volts as well. So let's give this a shot, see what it can produce. So right away I see a blue ring indicating we have power. We're going to plug into the USB-C1 port to begin with, and I'm going to drop this into a load. Alright, so this is negotiated 20 volts, and it's ramping up the current. My load can take up to 100 watts. This guy is not rated to do a full 100 watts. I believe it's something like 65 watts on the USB-C1 port. So power here, it's delivering 63 watts out of that top USB-C port. Now, according to the box, USB-C1 output can do 5, 9, 12, 15, or 20. So this is nice in that we have here about maybe 14 volts coming in, and so this guy is stepping up the input voltage up to 19.8, and it is stepping it up. So that's a good thing there. I've seen other devices that are not able to do higher than 12 volts with 12 volts in, but this one is stepping up that 12 volts to the 20 volt output. So you're getting basically the 65 watt USB-C power delivery out of that top port. Okay, we are going to test the second port while the first port is in operation. Let's see if I can get two of these guys plugged in at the same time. There we go. Okay, it is negotiating power. The top port is delivering 20 volts. It's ramping up the power, and we're up to 64 watts on the top port. The second port hasn't been plugged into anything yet. Let's fix that. I'm just going to plug a cell phone in. Relatively small load. Alright, it is charging rapidly, so it's negotiated 9 volts, and it's just, 1 amp, so not a lot of power here. We have 20 volts on C1, 9 volts on C2, and 0.6 amps is only going to be, 5 or so watts. But it has done USB-C power delivery. And also important is that the C1 and the C2 ports are at different voltages. So we have 20 volts coming out of C1 and 9 volts coming out of C2. Now I'm going to attempt to plug in a load on the third port at the same time. And this is just a 5 volt load. This is going to simulate a dash cam, for example. Just a minimal draw, but it is using the third port. Now, I do feel a little bit of heat coming out of this adapter in my hand, so it is generating some heat with all those voltage conversions. Alright, I'm setting this just to 1 amp to begin with. Okay, this guy here is drawing 1 amp. Now, I notice my C2 port has dropped down to 5 volts, so it looks like there's an interaction between the USB-A and the C2. C1 is still going at 20 volts, so we're getting 20 volts at 3 amps, so basically the full 65 watts is going out of the top port, but the second port has derated to 5 volts, so the second port and the USB-A port are at the same voltage level. And so what that means is this phone here, your second phone that's plugged in, is going to be charging, but charging slowly, or at least not charging rapidly. And so you're limiting your phone's charging as soon as you plug in a device in the USB-A port. So if you're looking to use this with just the two USB-C ports, it's going to work well with that. In that case, each of these ports negotiates the voltages separately. So we have 65 watts going to the top port. My phone really isn't taxing the second port. I'm going to go get a laptop and plug a laptop into the second port. I have a laptop here. I actually have this guy doing a video render, so it has a decent power draw. We're going to see what we can negotiate here. Alright, so it's having trouble with the laptop running it with this other load simultaneously. So C1 is doing 20 volts. The laptop is trying to negotiate something higher. I believe this laptop wants at least 12, maybe 20 volts to charge. It's not being able to charge on the C2 port here. It's, you know, basically bouncing up and down. It's not getting up to 20 volts. So the laptop is not able to charge off of that C2 port. Let me take the C1 off, and that is blazingly hot to the touch. It's uncomfortably hot. So even though it can push out the 65 watts out of that C1 port, with the 20 volts it gets very hot. So that's something to keep an eye on if you're charging a laptop in your car from this guy. It can get very hot there. Okay, so on the C2 port, it is now charging the laptop. It's at 10 volts, 10.8 volts, 2.3 amps. I don't remember 10 volts as a setting. Let's see. So it has 9 volts or 12 volts. And so I don't know if it's attempting 9 volts and going high or attempting 12 volts and going low. But it's 10 volts at 2.3 amps. And so power-wise, it's putting 25 watts into the laptop. So it looks like this C2 port is kind of maxing out here at around 25 watts. I'm going to just try the other meter just to make sure that I'm giving it a fair shake here. But let's try the C2 port with this meter here. And that guy is warm. Okay, it's connecting. Alright, now we're at 11.19 volts, so it's obviously trying to do the USB-C 12 volt 3 amp, and it's doing 11 volts at 2.3 amps, so it's 26 watts. So it does look like that second port is being limited here. And hey, if I read the box, it would tell me it would be. Alright, USB-C2 output 5 volts at 3 amps, 9 volts at 3 amps, or 12 volts at 2.5 amps. So it's trying to hit the 12 volts at 2.5 amps. It's a volt low on the voltage, it's 0.2 amps low on the amps. It's basically delivering 26 watts instead of the 30 watts that port is rated for. But, for a cell phone or something, that'd be fine. That thing charges cell phones just fine. For a laptop, you really want those laptops plugged into your top C1 port. When I do that, this guy here does 20 volts, 2.9 amps, it's doing 59 watts. And so it says it can do 20 volts at 3.25. So this is the max my laptop can draw. My laptop is maxing out at a 60 watt draw. Now if I put this guy into my big load, which can take up to 100 watts, so this big load here can go up to 100 watts, and so it's going to be limited by the car adapter. And so it is doing 19.7 volts, 3.17 amps. So it's not quite hitting 20 volts and the 3.25 amps that it's rated, but it's pretty close. So, power-wise, it's doing 62 watts instead of 65 watts. That's pretty good. It is getting very hot here. That's it's actually, quite warm to the touch there. And so I don't think I would be comfortable drawing 65 watts out of this for a long period of time. I'd be worried about something overheating or melting, or just hurting myself by touching it accidentally. I can't keep my fingers on that for super long. So you can deliver 65 watts out of that top outlet. It will get things hot when you do that. So I'm going to stop that for now. All right, we're at 58, 59 centigrade here. And that guy is very warm to the touch. You don't want to touch that for very long at all. So I'm going to end the test here because I think that's getting a little warm for the plastic adapter I have it plugged into. So let me see about the interaction between USB-C2 and USB-A. It says here, USB-C2 plus USB-A output is limited to 5 volts at 3 amps. And that is essentially what I've found, is if I plug something into the USB-A channel that's at 5 volts, the USB-C channel also drops down to 5 volts. So it does say USB-A could do 5 volts, 9 volts, or 12 volts by itself. So essentially, this is just slightly better than others I've seen. I've seen some where the USB-C1 could not get up to 20 volts with a 12 volt supply. This guy is taking the 12 to 14 volts in and bumping it up to 20 volts, but it is getting very hot when it's doing that. So the step up is having some efficiency losses. And so the USB C1 and C2 can go at the same time. C2 is limited to 12 volts. All right, so in summary, USB C1 can get up to 65 watts. I've seen it do 63 watts at 20 volts, and it will step up like a 14 volt car supply up to 20 volts, but it gets very hot when it's doing that. So I don't recommend charging, big laptops or things that are taking 60, 65 watts out of this guy, because it is getting very hot when it's doing that. I mean, it still works, but it's uncomfortable to the touch at the heat there. Now, USB-C2 can go up to 12 volts, and it says 2.5 amps. I've never seen it get that high. The best I've seen out of here is like 11 volts at maybe 2.1 amp. So it's not hitting the full specification there, even all by itself alone, but it's getting close. So if you have two cell phones, USB C1 and C2 will charge them just fine, no problem. Now, the USB-A port is tied to USB C2 in that if you have something on the USB-A port, and you're trying to use C2, they'll both go to 5 volts. And so because they're both at 5 volts, you're not going to be getting the highest power delivery with USB C2 power delivery charging, and you won't be able to do things like the quick charging that USB-A port supports as well. So for the most part, if you occasionally need to draw 65 watts in an emergency, this is kind of nice to have that capability, but I think this is still really useful just for two cell phones, not really for 3 devices. So either USB-A and USB-C1, or USB-C1 and USB-C2 with nothing in USB-A. So unfortunately, this is a slight improvement over what I have in that I can get more power out of it with a lot more heat. But I cannot run all 3 devices with 2 of them at USB-C power delivery and 1 just at 5 volts for my dash cam.